Well, the family settled on this farm in 1820, around 1820, and they had a log cabin over in this area over here. And then the road out to the main road on the front of the property. And in 1850 or so, the house that you see up there, my family built the house in about 1850. It's gone through a couple of renovations since then, obviously. And then the old barn, there used to be another barn between the two buildings, the old horse barn they called it. And it was torn down decades ago. And then the third house, the third building you see, was built for my uncle and aunt. He was a war veteran from World War II. They didn't have any money, and so they built that on 2 acres, and that's where they settled. And my cousins grew up. Basically, it's a 400-acre farm with the maple sugar bush, 17-acre field that we're in here now. When I was a young kid, elementary school age, my dad was a dairy farmer. And he went into teaching and rented the farm to the neighbor. It was a pig farm, and I used to go down and clean the pig pens on Saturday mornings for 25 cents for the morning. And then my brother moved in, and about 20 some odd years ago, and he put it in beef. So he had beef cattle here, about 130, 140 head total at one point. And he farmed it. Now it's just, he just crops it. He grows the hay and sells the hay. But it's been in family hands since 1820, built here, and we've lived here since 1820. My nephews, who grew up in the house, now my brother's sons, are the 7th generation of the family in the same house. We have a clock at our place in Lennoxville that was a wedding gift to my great-great-great-grandfather, I think it was, in 1843. And if we fixed one wooden gear in it, would still work. The table that we eat at, our dining room set, came up with my grandmother's family from the New England states before 1900. So we're still using the dining room set today. It was my grandmother's set when I was growing up. So there's a lot of family history on this farm here. So this is what we used to call the sugar camp. We're in the middle of the maple sugar bush here. It's all overgrown now. This hasn't been used since about probably 1965 or so. And back in the 50s, they would tap about 1,000 trees. They would have buckets, individual buckets on the trees. Originally, they would gather them by horse with a great big tub. And then my grandfather and dad went to a tractor to do all the gathering. And then they put in pipeline. Back in the early 60s, they put in pipeline to avoid having to empty all the buckets by hand. And the old maple sugar camp that was here, the holding tank right over on this side is where the sap was brought into, and then it was fed down into the boiling arches, and you can actually see remnants of the old boiling arches in here, where they would run 24 hours a day, keep the fires going, and the sap would be progressively evaporated until they'd end up at this end with the finished maple syrup. And they would take it off at this end, and I don't know how many gallons they produced at the time, but the family probably ran this sugar camp for probably the better part of 3 decades before my dad went into teaching, gave up the dairy farm and went into teaching. And he would have stopped in about 1964 or 65, and obviously over the years now it's completely collapsed. So the sap, the sugar camp itself, where the boilers were, and that end was where the wood was stored. To keep the wood dry, we'd spend the summertime putting wood in there, and the wood was then used to feed the fires to boil the sap down. Throughout the last several generations, the family always attended the little Baptist church in the village about 4.5 kilometers away, Sawyerville. That church was built in the late 1700s, and it is of the various kinds of Baptist churches in Canada, the Fellowship Baptist Church Association. This is the oldest Fellowship Baptist Church in Canada. And my brother still attends there today, a lot of generations there. When I was growing up, my grandfather had honeybees. He usually had about 25 colonies of honeybees, so we always had fresh honey. I would help use the old-fashioned centrifugal extractor to get the honey out of the honeycombs at the end of the year. We would have honey that would be late honey would be goldenrod, very, very strong tasting honey. We would have clover honey. We would have apple tree honey in various honey seasons during the summer. Honey had very, very different taste. Same as the maple syrup, actually. Early maple syrup is all a little sweeter and lighter than the later maple syrup in the couple of weeks of the season. My grandfather and father were fairly innovative. They were the first farmers in the area to put pipeline into the maple sugar bush so they wouldn't have to gather the sap by hand. They were the first ones to have a baler so they could bale their hay, little square bales, instead of putting it in loose into the haymow. Dad was the first one, before he put pipeline in, he was the first one to use tractor instead of horses to gather the sap, and I can remember doing that. They put milking machines into the barn when most other farmers were still doing everything by hand, milking cows by hand. So they were fairly innovative, but it was a small enough farm at 400 acres, they just couldn't make a go of it for 2 families. So that's when Dad went in, he had his degree in geography from Queen's University and went and finished his teacher training at Bishop's when he had 3 young children, and went into teaching and stayed with the school board for the rest of his career. This is actually the new barn, if you can believe it. The new barn was built in about probably 50 or 55 sometime. The old barn burnt down. Fire, lightning struck it. The old barn burnt down. This was the new barn, built in about the late 40s, early 50s. Initially, the track that's up in the top peak, the hay was brought in loose on wagons, and then there was a big, you can see the pulley up there. The pulley would come down and pull the hay right to the back of the mow along the track at the peak of the roof. And then Dad got his baler in the late 50s, and then the wagons would be taken right up into the barn, and the square bales would then be stored to be fed to the dairy cows. And so the basement of the barn, or the stable, was where the cows were brought in and milked, and where they stayed for the winter time. And then they would be put out in the pastures for the summer and brought in twice a day. One of my jobs as a 5-year-old and 6-year-old was to run over into the pasture and bring the cows in the morning for milking. They would respond to Dad calling and my grandfather calling, "Come boss, come boss," and they would come running because they knew it was time to be milked and time for some meal, which they considered a treat. So this was the barn that paid the bills when I was a kid growing up.